Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. I am once again joined by the two loveliest gentlemen in Ottawa, Ryan and Brett. Gentlemen, how are we doing
Oh,
today?
very good. How are you?
Good, dude.
Excellent. Ryan's out angling everybody on the internet today. Clothing optional podcast.
I figured the traps were going to come out a little bit today.
I need to do more shruggy shrugs. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, my pump cover is on in hiding.
My running cover is on. It's like I don't even have a running bod. I've got a dad, not even a dad bod. I have a running bod. I'm not sure which one's worse.
The irony is in public, I wear just big baggy shirts.
Yeah.
At this point, like only at home would I wear something like this.
You just out in public. You're just a big dude who's out of breath.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So this is really funny. We were talking about before we sort of got on air about content. I literally just made a piece of content, or I sent away a piece of content about not being a giant fat ass and doing your cardio all year.
Yeah.
Which I will call myself out that I am intermittently good at doing that. But at least currently is something I'm a little bit more consistent with.
I'm proud of you, man. It's a big step. 2025, the year of transformation for Ryan.
Yeah, it's literally 45 minutes of cardio a week.
It's how it starts. You're gonna be a gym bunny before you know.
I'm on that Stairmaster.
That's right. Today, we're like we talked about before, we're going to be taking a little bit of a different angle to the conversation. We got some great feedback from some of our listeners that they enjoyed some of our like more targeted episodes and episodes that have a theme. And one of the conversations that we had recently was doing a case study episode. And so, each of us have come heavily armed with a case study to kind of, present and as a means of fleshing out some themes, and we'll kind of see where some of these conversations go. Ryan, I know earlier you were like, ET, why don't you go first? I'm going to override you. I don't want to go first.
Right.
Brett, you're going first. Lead with your case study. Who did you have in mind? And let's talk about it.
Rock on. So I think I've mentioned before, I've had a lot of doctors on my roster.
That's right.
Just like a weird number for someone who doesn't really work in medicine. And so I wanted to highlight one who I've been working with for, I think, like 5 years now. She is like chief of her section, also works in another hospital, just insanely busy. And I feel like it's a good person to highlight who doesn't necessarily have any elite athletic goals, but just wants to like age well and do as best as she can given her time constraints, which are significant, because she works in the ICU, which means in Ottawa, in her particular hospital, are like 36-hour call shifts. This is bonkers, but she might be awake for like 2 days in one of these call shifts, basically. And so seeing her at post call versus when she's got an off week is like a very, very different person. So I thought it would be kind of an interesting one to highlight. I wanted to kind of start it off with I certainly felt this way. I don't know if other trainers do, but I was feeling a little intimidated when I started to just train a few doctors and just thinking like, this person knows so much about the body. How can I possibly teach them anything? And it turns out
that way as well. Yeah.
It turns out doctors, for the most part, don't actually have a lot of knowledge around the musculoskeletal system. Yeah. They're focused on internal medicine or whatever their specialty is, but don't necessarily have a great knowledge of musculoskeletal injuries or how to progress with training. And so and they appreciated the fact that I spoke in biomechanical terms and I used anatomical, words and, I talk smart sometimes. So I think they appreciated.
I talk
not on the podcast, but with
when I can think of that. So it went well. And I think that is part of the reason why I have trained so many doctors. But yeah, for this particular client, you know, she is a runner and wants to continue progress in her running. So that's one major goal. Another one is she really loves to travel. And when she travels, it's not like a sit down on the beach vacation. It's always like a hike. She went to Patagonia. She attempted to do Everest Base Camp and caught like a brutal infection part of the way up and had to get like hella lifted off of the side of the mountain, which is, for anybody else would be a traumatic story, but for her, she was like, it was so awesome, I got to ride in a helicopter. So she's like barely breathing. Anyways, so obviously very active lifestyle and a lot of like hill climbing and just trying to maintain all of that with this insane work schedule. So we've got very, very different workouts now. If she's coming off of a call shift, especially an especially challenging call shift, you know, sometimes we're just going for like 20 to 30 minutes of actual work. And then we're moving on to like some like mobility, stretching, and just kind of like calm down sessions. And then if we've got her on an off week, then we can really start to like hammer it and push a little bit and you know, bring up the intensity because she's got that available energy.
Can I interject just to kind of highlight this? Because I was going to ask this question, then you answered it, but I think it's something that's worth talking about. When you have clients in particular that have incredibly busy lives, you know, if you're awake for 36 hours, we know that that is an environment that's not conducive to hard training and then therefore recovery. And what I like that you kind of highlighted there is the fact that it seems as though her training is auto-regulated based on what her recovery capacity is due to her work. I think a lot of people I definitely fell into this at one point in time where was like a stickler for the logbook, and their lifestyle may or may not be conducive to sticking with that. So I thought it was just worth highlighting, you know, if you've got clients who are really busy and maybe they're at a stage in their life where they can't just hammer it with training, that is potentially the place where you toggle their stress.
Definitely. And that's a really great point, because I think I was more of a stickler to like the logbook and like, we got to get our sets in for the day. And it was actually working at the old gym with Etienne, who mentioned that like when his clients come in, there isn't necessarily a plan. There's kind of like a bit of a focus for the day, but he said he's willing to like, you know, play it by ear and call audibles and change things up on the fly depending on what the client's feeling. And that was a really kind of like eye-opening moment. It's like, oh, it's not lazy if I don't have like a 10-point plan and know I've programmed every minute of this session before they walk in. And I think that comes with experience too. Like you've got the knowledge and ability to see where your client's at and be like, okay, this isn't working out today. Let's pivot and try something else.
It's interesting, if I may. I love that you, Ryan, I love that you brought up that question, because for me, I was like, oh, that's something I'd like to circle back to, which is like, just how do you navigate someone who goes, you know, your training decisions with someone who goes 2 days without sleep? Like, that's not just like, I'm a little sleep deprived. That's like, you got like, I don't know. I mean, you're not even just sleep deprived. You're just like, I don't know. You're just awake.
Dead.
You're just dead. And the ramifications on health, cognition. So I'd be curious to kind of hear you kind of like pull on that thread a little bit more. But before we do, I wanted to just kind of double click on what you mentioned about that moment at Epic, which is cool. I didn't know that it had that effect. I'm happy to hear that. One of the ways that I kind of frame things in my mind is this idea of just having a rough draft for the day. And I think that this doesn't always apply to folks. For instance, Ryan, I don't think that would necessarily, I wouldn't take that approach with you. But for like your average day-to-day person who has just an ass load of commitments and maybe has trouble keeping all of the balls in the air, so to speak, that they've got going on in their life, and they're just hanging on by a thread. If you try to jam like a rigid protocol into a system that is incredibly like chaotic and dynamic, Some people respond really well to that. I'm actually like, I find that I'm kind of one of those people where like, if I get hit with structure when things are really chaotic, it actually helps me organize my day.
Me too.
It applies like a stress that for me is really helpful. And as much as that's true, I found that for a lot of people, they're just not receptive to it. And maybe there's like coaching gap there. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to kind of frame that. I think that there's an element of, I think, just acknowledging the context that you're operating in with your client. And if just like, do we need to be flexible here, or do we need to be kind of like more rigid around expectations and behavioral deliverables, I guess you could say. So anyways, I'd be curious to know if you have any thoughts on that. And then following that, I'd love to kind of hear how, like, what's your approach with this doctor who's super busy, sleep deprived for 2 days? Like, can we let's pull on that thread a little bit.
Definitely. So I always know in advance if she's got an off week or if it's post call, or a call week. Often we're trying to optimize the days that she can work and trying to get her in on a day that she's got the most rest, even within a call week. And then, if she's got some help, if she's got like a resident in the ICU with her, then potentially she can like jump on the couch and get a awful 3 hours of sleep, which is, these call shifts, I say she's awake for 36 hours. It's probably rare that she's awake for that full 36 hours. Having said that, I don't know how good of a rest you're getting. How much REM sleep are you getting on an uncomfortable couch in a hospital? Right. Because, some doctors, in case you're not aware of it, some doctors, even within the hospital, their call shifts can take place at home. They're just basically have to have their phone on and ready to answer calls the minute they come in and potentially go in. And then some doctors, in the case of the ICU at Montfort, their call shift is in the ICU. So they're there in person that whole time, which she is
interesting.
Part of.
I didn't know that. That's I didn't know that.
Pardon the noise there. So when I know that she's coming off of a call shift or a call week, generally we'll stack the harder work earlier in the workout because she tends to fade fast, is what we've noticed. 20 to 30 minutes will usually follow up the program that I've written, just kind of like shortened, because I also tend to stack the more important things near the start of the workout. More like compound movements and things that she's going to get more out of, and the stuff that's more accessory, less necessary. I mean, that's pretty normal programming rules, I think, near the end. So that's the stuff I'm more willing to cut. And then, if we get, 20, 30 minutes in, I start to notice that she's dragging a little bit. It's like, okay, we'll do 5 more minutes here, and then we're going to switch to mobility and stretching, which she also has a lot of issues with, being just a ball of stress who just is working all the time. Has seen great impacts from mobility and stretching. That's generally how I'll structure it in those post-call shifts. I'm also a lot more flexible with her, especially around cancellations. And I know that's not a great business model. I'm a lot more strict with my non-doctors.
Disagree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's worked out. We've been training for 5 years.
So, yeah, for sure.
I was going to say, I think that we've talked about this a billion times on this podcast.
With a B.
I think that cancellation policies exist, in my opinion, like 90% strictly. Mm-hmm. And I think that 10% can exist if it maintains the relationship that you have with the client. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to lose money on one session if it means on the back end I've got a client that thinks that I've got their back, Mm-hmm.
And it's like, especially during COVID, right? Like, she's an ICU doctor, literally saving lives. The ICU is like filled up and like they're on like absolute emergency, whatever. And it's like she's canceling because she's like dealing with COVID patients and not sleeping. Like, I'm not going to charge her for that. Are you insane? This is like, she's out there on the front line saving lives. I would not feel right doing that.
So, Brett, go ahead, ET.
Sorry, I'll make this really, really quick. But you mentioned something earlier. I think you used the word investment when you were talking about like varying the stressors perhaps like week by week, depending on it. And it reminded me, because I've used that language with one of my other clients who isn't a doctor, but she has a genetic condition. She has thalassemia, major or minor. I'm drawing a blank on if it's an uppercase M or a lowercase m. But essentially what it is that she doesn't produce her own hemoglobin, which for those that don't know, for women, it's actually called shemoglobin, in case you didn't know.
Get out.
How many fucking times have I heard that joke?
Hey, it's one of my favorite jokes. So she actually told that joke to her physician, and the physician was just like, "Oh my god!" Like eyes rolled back almost so far that they did a backflip, you know. But so this client of mine doesn't produce hemoglobin, and so she needs to get transfusions every 4 weeks. And so post transfusion, she's a fucking machine. The week after, still a machine. The week after starts to fade. After that, she's Indian and like she's white like you, Rye. Like her last week,
Wow,
she's
that's crazy.
White, yeah. And so it's expected within her training where we have investment weeks. It's literally the language we use with her. Cool. It's like, these are our investment weeks. We have 2 where we go hard. The 3rd, it's moderate in terms of volume. And then the 4th, it's like just come in to maintain the habit kind of a thing. And I mean, now we're doing remote training.
It's like you actually have, it's almost like you have a deload paradigm built in.
100%, 100%. Yeah. And like, we kind of drew some parallels with like finance, where it's like, you have more to invest. So you invest more this week, and on the weeks where you have less, you invest less, and it's totally fine, you know? So I just wanted to kind of double click that, because it's interesting that there's parallels there between you and I, because I don't think we've ever talked about that, but the language is the same. I find that fascinating. Ryan, you were going to say something? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So I had 2 questions for you, Brett. The first one, so with a client where, you know, their training is so auto-regulated, depending on their schedule, et cetera, what metrics and like what data are you gathering to show that she's actually progressing? And then my second question is, as you said, she's like a big stress case. How important is it for you to have like congruency of care between you and like another practitioner?
Great questions. First one. So in terms of progress, we use her like running pace and like how a certain pace feels on a regular basis. It's very different, you know, if Etienne knows this, but like very different inside versus outside. And she does a lot of treadmill running in the wintertime. So we've got to kind of like keep that in mind, that the indoor runs are not going to match the pace of the outdoor runs, but that's a big one. During the session, we measure heart rate and like the difficulty of a particular weight and set mid workout, and then we track those in perpetuity. So like looking back on like, you know, 2 years ago, you know, how are you generally feeling? But let's look at the weights that you were doing, and it seems like, you know, a set of squats with 40-pound kettlebell was an 8 for you then, and now it's a 6. So we are still making some progress going forward.
So you mentioned like tracking her heart rate. Do you take into account, like I've never really done this consistently, but I know people who will actually use HRV as a metric that they like track over the long term. Is that something that you guys look at all?
Haven't used that yet. That's an interesting idea though. I'd like to look into that a little bit more, but
because I would imagine, you know, with somebody like her, who's her ability to recover is going to be like fluctuate so much. I wonder how I would think it would be helpful potentially to be able to see what her HRV is and how that potentially lines up with her schedule, et cetera. Like I said, it's not really something I've ever really tracked in any meaningful way, but I know that it's a piece of data that people will use.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Mostly we're just using it for like, sorry, Etienne, I'll let you go in a second.
It's okay, buddy. Go ahead.
Heart rate in terms of like, it is also a reflection of her hydration levels too, which are also a constant issue. It was worse when, you know, she was forced to wear N95 masks all the time and couldn't drink for most of a shift. It's getting better in general, but That along with the fatigue are really going to affect heart rate, her heart rate during the workout. So that's generally what we're kind of looking at. If like we're getting big spikes throughout the workout, it's like, okay, well, I think today's the day that, or like later on today, we're going to kind of back off a little bit, reduce the intensity. Sorry, go ahead, ET.
It's all good, man. It's your case study. You get the priority. I just wanted to kind of circle back to HRV. HRV is it's a metric that has become like increasingly popular over the course of the past like 5 or so years. More and more people are tracking physiological data, and one of the main how would I say reasons why people use HRV is to use it as an indicator of perhaps like general allostatic load, how recovered we are, and then also all of that as a means of predicting performance. It's kind of like it's all generally speaking meant to kind of point towards that. And I always was really fascinated by it, and I was bummed that my Garmin didn't track it. And then I listened to a podcast by Olav Alexander Boo. I was just pulling up his name here. I don't know if you've heard of this guy. Really, really worth checking out. He is the coach for Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden, who are known as the Norwegian Train. These are two guys that are smoking people in the world of triathlons. Olav is an engineer and very much like an innovator in the domain of tracking various physiological metrics, like playing around with like rectal probes for more like accurate thermal pressure. Yeah. So his clients
for that.
Yeah. No, but it's like, he's like, yeah, you want to know your core temperature? Get something in there, right? In contrast to
that'll definitely make me run faster.
yeah, or cycle real fast also, just because of the pressure.
Just take the seat off of your bike.
Jokes aside, he is known in the training world as being the most data-driven and meticulous coach, and he despises HRV.
Interesting.
Which I was not expecting at all. And despise might be a strong word, but he's just like, meh. He's just kind of like, it's interesting, but he's noticed that it doesn't actually have a strong correlation with athlete performance. And so it's kind of one of those things where he tracks it for the sake of tracking it. But the thing that he prioritizes the most in the coaching relationship is the client or the athlete relationship. Number one, how the athlete
seems like
feels.
That always comes back up.
It's crazy, right?
And that's really interesting from an engineer. Like clearly he has the data thing going, but like having that human connection as well. That's a wide spectrum of skills for him.
Yeah, and it's like the data that he values the most is like the athlete's felt sense of preparedness. And even like on Garmin's, and Ryan, I'm assuming that you don't know what I'm about to talk about, but if you go for a run or a bike or something, Garmin will
I don't
eventually.
Understand these words you're using.
Yeah, is that a food?
Can I put that in my air fryer?
By a bike, a cycle. Is that like? Are we talking about PEDs? Like, what's going on?
It's kind of cycle I'm interested in.
Yeah. Garmin will let you know like what's your level of preparedness. And so like I went for a run the other day, and it was like you're at +4, and I felt like dog shit, but like I should have been performing really well. And I felt horrible that day. And then there's been days where I've been at like -3 and I'll set a PB. So it's the kind of thing that it's a really interesting metric right now, because I think it's going through its kind of testing phase, and people are kind of figuring out when would I use it, when might I not. And anyways, I felt like sharing that because quite literally one of the most data-driven coaches on the planet is allocating less importance to it than quite literally most people that are on the HRV train right now. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, and I'll add to that. I'm probably nowhere near his level, but I'm definitely somebody who values data quite a bit. And I would say, kind of like what he said, I think that probably the two things that I'm going to pay attention to the most, if we're talking about in the gym, training performance for sure. And I would say training performance over time. But I like subjective data from clients I probably care about the most. Because even if you had, like an HRV number or the preparedness number that would state that you should have a good training session, and maybe even physiologically that's an accurate representation of what's going on. If somebody doesn't feel good, like their ability to train and have a really successful training session probably isn't going to be, it's not going to be top notch, right? So that's something where I probably similar to him, I care a lot just about like how a person feels. There's definitely a lot of subjective and like almost emotional conversations with clients, and that drives certainly a significant portion of the decision making, as long as it's sort of done in conjunction with some like hard data as well.
If I can kind of wrap up my
let's do it.
Case study here with a funny story. One time this client came to me. We were supposed to meet at the gym. I start getting some texts from her. I knew she was coming off of a call shift for this one, fairly early in our sessions together. And I start getting some messages from her saying like, I might be a little bit late. I've got a really complicated case. And then the messages are like, oh, I've actually got to hop in an ambulance and follow this guy to the Heart Institute. But don't worry, I'm going to make our session. I'm like, it's okay to cancel. Don't worry about it. She's like, no, I'm going to take a cab from the Heart Institute back to the gym. I'll meet you there. Sure enough, she does. If she wasn't super late, maybe 10 minutes, but like literally at the end of a call shift, saved a guy's life in the ambulance on the way to the Heart Institute. I don't know exactly what she was doing, but it sounds like it was like CPR, like resuscitation in the ambulance. Saved this guy's life. Came to me like right out of the cab and is just like an absolute ball of energy. She's like vibrating. And like, I'd never seen her like this. She's like off the wall talking a mile a minute. And like, she's like, I got all the energy in the world. And so we like start working. And within 20 minutes, she is like almost falling asleep standing. It was the craziest adrenaline crash I'd ever seen in my life. And like coming off of no sleep too. Obviously like all those hormones are just like jacked up, and just like, it was wild to see her like come in bouncing off the walls. And by halfway through our session, she's just like, I think we need to stop.
I mean, kudos to her. 'Cause I was thinking like, if the tag on my shirt is in the wrong place and scratching my skin, I'm like, it's done. The day's a write-off. Can't train. Going back to bed.
Yeah, I think after that one, I told her like, let's not do that again. Like, if this situation happens again, just cancel. It's fine.
Man, that story is, I mean, that's really funny. And it reminds me of one of my favorite parts of this work, which is, of course, the human piece, and like really getting to know your clients as people, and then also to get to know your clients as professionals. It's one of the things I love the most is like when you get to see your clients, and like you get to see them not as a client, which is like they're there to, in many ways, learn, and you're leading them through some kind of a transformation, generally speaking, of course. When you get to see them in their zone of genius, when you get to see like how incredibly fucking competent they are at like what they do, that's one of the things that I find the most intoxicating. I find that really 100%. Fun. So I appreciate you sharing that. Ryan, case study, let it rip.
Yeah. So I figured my case study, I think what would be, I think what is cool about this is I think we all probably work with very unique and different populations from one another.
Yeah.
So I wanted to lean more on the side of a competitor.
Cool.
And, I think very similar to most people, definitely have a large history of working with Gen Pop. Over the last couple of years, that's shifted, where the majority of my clients, I would say, exercise isn't necessarily supplemental to their life. It's like the priority. So similar, like I would imagine your client, fitness is really important, and she has a career that requires a tremendous amount of focus, attention, etc. A lot of my clients now are, many of them are people that work within the industry. So they themselves are clients and coaches, or they work in the periphery in the industry, like they're practitioners of sort. And many of them are, if they're not competitors, they're very serious. So it's, as we were talking about, auto-regulating, collecting data, there's probably a greater degree of rigidity in my plans because there are less variables that we have to manage outside of the stress from training. I will say, as we kind of alluded to before, just worth kind of noting off the top, there's absolutely still an element of auto-regulation because, something I've said before is even your clients who are high-level competitors or athletes, in any sport, they're still human beings underneath the surface. They've still got their own shit. They've got, they might have spousal problems or, stress from work, whatever it happens to be. So there's always an element of that I think needs to come into play. So with that being said, I had a couple of notes. I have 9. I think some of these we can go through really quickly.
9 clients or points about this one client?
Points about this one particular client. So okay. I think we can talk about,
sure.
Particular if you're working with, in this case, a physique client. So T, her, I bring her up a lot on the podcast. My client, Rosina, she's like a total rock star. She's been a phenomenal client from day one. When I started working with her, she was already somebody who had, I think, about 5 years of lifting experience, some structured dieting, and wanted to take the next step and get involved in competitive bodybuilding. So she competes in the bikini division. And our initial conversation, and this is something I think, if we're talking especially with competitors, but it could apply to anybody, I think step 1 is having a needs analysis. So looking at her and, what is the end goal? Getting on stage, doing well, etc. Based on where she's at, what are the things that we have to address in order to get her there? In her particular case, she had never dieted to, competition level conditioning. She's quite young. I think she is 24, I believe, and is a natural competitor. So that's always something to consider. The rate of muscularity gains year by year are just going to be slower with somebody like that. So our main priority, I think we had maybe about a 6-month period of time where we toggled between kind of calorie surplus, maintenance, got an idea of how her body responded to things. Something I really like to do with clients before they ever get into like a contest prep is I want to have a period of time working with them ahead of time where we have a really good understanding of what kind of diet structure works well with them, what kind of training structure works well with them. We're not trying to correct technique when they're 8 weeks out from a show. And the only thing that they've got to work on is just checking the box. And, it's also something I think is huge with those types of clients. If you have the opportunity to work with them through an off season, depending on how long that happens to be. So Rosina, in this case, we're taking probably about 18 months away from stage, maybe even 2 years away from stage. A lot of people will lose focus during that period of time, and having some structure and some coaching to make sure that they are, doing the things that they need to be doing to grow and make progress from show to show is really important. A lot of people, there's like a level of excitement when it comes to a contest prep. You've got this really distinct end date. There's some glam around it. It's a really cool event. You see your body changing week by week. It's very easy to nail all of the behaviors. And then when that goal isn't so apparent, like the timeline isn't so apparent, some of those behaviors start to fall off. So anyway, with that being said, after you've done a needs analysis, what does this client need? Where are our areas of focus going to be? In her case, the biggest thing was just getting her to a point where we are really happy with her technique being incredibly repeatable, highly effective without, something we've talked about on the with some of the courses is like having a good SFR, so high stimulus to fatigue ratio. So just adopting techniques where we're getting a high magnitude of stimulus without just like beating the crap out of her for the sake of it. And then finding a diet structure that worked really well for her so that when it came time to prep, we weren't adopting all of these brand new habits. And then from there, a really important thing from a competition standpoint is establishing timeline. So something that I will like to do, and I will say it is easier when you have more experienced clients because you have some previous data to work off of. Usually their stage weight, how conditioned they were, so on and so forth. Generally speaking, for newer clients, especially for natural clients, I want that timeline to be longer because there are certain tools that they're just not going to use that an enhanced competitor would to either accelerate fat loss or preserve muscle tissue. And almost everybody carries more fat than they think. So I usually tell people this, like, so I was 253 this morning. And like, I'll be 253 with like, I've got some pec veins and abs and stuff like that. I would probably have to lose 25 to 30 pounds to get on stage.
It's
so
huge.
There's a huge distinction between what I call peak lean and stage lean. And there's a greater delta between those than people realize sometimes. You can always be in a position where you can throttle back a little bit. You can only really push the timeline so fast.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you just a quick follow-up question on like those two different kind of categories of lean? You mentioned stage lean and what was the other word?
Like beach lean.
Beach lean. So with your athletes, because I mean, like you're talking about like right now you have pec veins, ab veins, 253, you said?
Yes, 253 this morning.
And for you to be on stage, you'd have to drop like 25 to 30-ish.
So I was 225 on stage this last summer.
So what comes to mind for me is how that's just, and I know you know this, but for those that are listening, that's just not a healthy and sustainable place to be.
Correct.
You're doing that for the sake of the sport. It's like, let's bring myself close to death and have bring a certain package to the stage and with the aim of being competitive. Do you have like, how would I say, conversations revolving around leanness and health, like with your athletes?
Yep.
And if so, like, what does that look like? I'm going to make perhaps an assumption that that some of those conversations might be a little bit more likely with a female clientele, but I'm not totally sure. I'd be really curious to kind of hear you pull on that thread a bit.
Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is yes. Just explaining everything that people are getting into. And no matter how well you manage fatigue, so this is something, I'll kind of explain this a little bit more, but no matter how well you manage fatigue, no matter how perfectly your timeline is set up and able to do so, the human body does not want to be, if you're a male, 4 or 5 or 6%, or if a female, you're like 10, 11% body fat. That is beyond the scope, beyond the stage of something that you can really maintain at a healthy point. And some stuff's going to kick in where your body starts deprioritizing other systems and is just going to conserve energy. It's going to want you to eat food so that you essentially don't die, because it doesn't know you're doing a bodybuilding show. It's like this person has been deprived of nutrients for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. So explaining that no matter what, that's going to happen. The degree to which that happens is going to depend on a variety of variables, many of which are just individual, genetic. We talk about hunger hormones, things like that. It's going to depend on often how aggressively you push fat loss. The harder you push it, very likely the worse you're going to feel, which is why I also tend to like longer timelines. I'm going to steal a phrase. I believe it's from Luke Miller, but I could be wrong on this. He calls contest prep, he reframes, it's not a fat loss phase, it's a stress management phase. So the goal is to lose body fat in a way that you can sustain and manage that deficit for as long as possible. So you are always just trying to find ways to manage that fatigue while you are pulling down, which can be done through a variety of methods, but a lot of that is going to be timeline related and just not putting yourself in a position where you've just got to throttle down for weeks on end. So things that clients will experience negatives, almost certainly in some capacity: extreme hunger, extreme food focus. We've talked about GLP-1 medications and stuff before, and people that have that type of food focus all the time. If you get that lean and you've been dieting chronically, you're going to get to that point. Like, I remember having vivid food dreams night after night. Like, I could like taste a hamburger in my sleep.
In the past, you've mentioned that I'm either a snack or a meal. Do you ever dream about me in that way?
I think you know the answer to that.
Nice. It explains the morning text.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so extreme hunger, food focus, etc. Like, I remember being angry watching TV shows where there'd be like food in the background and people weren't eating it. And like, people will experience some degree of irritability, loss of patience. Almost certainly, like, almost everybody gets to a certain point where like your libido is probably going to be completely in the tank. For women, something to be really mindful of is, again, once you get that lean, you're very likely going to lose your menses. That is also a really important metric to pay attention to post-show. Once women start menstruating again, it's probably a good indication that they are at least on the way to being healthier and their health metrics are improving. So whether you're a male or a female coach, but you're working with female athletes, paying attention and having conversations about like what their period and what their cycle is like is really important. And conversations about libido. Like, we make a bunch of sex jokes on this podcast, but having a healthy libido is a part of being a normal functioning human being. And returning back to that baseline post-show is really important. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, brain fog, etc. So like, you're going to feel crappy at some point, and understanding what you're signing up for, knowing that that's coming, is really important. Now, with that being said, and this is sort of onto my point 4, when we talk about timelines, when we talk about managing fatigue, there's a variety of things that we can do here. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Not being in a position where you have to dig too hard, too fast for too long is probably the single biggest thing. After that is ensuring that people have high quality sleep. Mm-hmm. Once your sleep starts getting really deranged, all those problems start getting worse really quick. So putting a massive degree of importance on people's sleep hygiene. So, I'll have conversations about setting up a sleep schedule, going to bed, things that we've sort of heard before, but going to bed and waking up at the same time, not being on their phone in bed, having a cool room, having white noise, blackout curtains. So in Rosina's case, because sleep eventually started to become an issue, we started upping her magnesium dose and she started taking more melatonin. I think we also supplemented with ashwagandha at one point as well, because she was getting some anxiety before bed. And then her curtains weren't great from a light perspective. And she's someone who would go to bed late, wake up late. So I had her buy off Amazon sleep mask so that she still had darkness so that she could get higher quality sleep. So that would be sort of the second priority is really maintaining high level of sleep quality. After that, most people are going to have some combination of being in a calorie deficit as well as having some kind of activity increase, whether that be via steps or, higher intensity. Like, I usually say, have a heart rate threshold, let's say 130 beats per minute, have X amount of time per week above that. They're going to have some combination of that as a means of driving being in a calorie deficit to lose body fat. Depending on the individual and what they struggle with the most, whether you add more cardio or you pull food down or whatever it happens to be is going to be dependent on the type of stress that they have. So I'm somebody where I can handle low food if I want to. Doesn't really bother me that much. I find doing a lot of cardio really hard on my feet. My feet get really beat up. It kind of compounds this level of stress. So I would typically pull harder on bringing my food down as opposed to just driving a ton of activity up. Other people are really happy to do an hour of cardio a day and 15,000 steps, and keep their food higher. So that people call that a high energy flux versus low energy flux. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is just, again, person dependent. The type of, we talk about subjective feedback, the type of feedback you get from the client. Mm-hmm. I think the other mistake that people make is they assume that you've got to just beat the shit out of somebody in prep. Like, this is your time to be a warrior and whatever it happens to be. My way that I typically will approach a contest prep, if they've already competed before, I probably know a previous stage weight, or I've just seen enough people, I can kind of ballpark how heavy I think they'll be on stage. Like I think I told Rosina I thought we'd be around 115 on stage, and I think she was 116.2. So we were really fucking close. And what we did is we worked our way backwards. So we said, all right, on average, we're going to shoot for about 1% total body weight loss per week. So she started about 140. So it was like, if we split the difference, let's say 1.2 pounds per week. So we know from there, if we're going to say about 115, that's about 20 weeks. We also know there's going to be a peak week in there. We're going to try to take a couple of diet break weeks in there as a means of managing fatigue. Mm-hmm. And we'll add an extra week for just shit happens. So then we created this timeline of 24 weeks. I've had other clients where I had a guy where he won his Ottawa show, and we'd originally set a timeline, I think, of 16 weeks. At 10 weeks, he was ready. So we jumped at a show 4 weeks early because there was no reason for him to keep dieting because he was shredded. We never did any cardio. I never gave him a step target. I think only the last 2 weeks his food even dropped below 3,000 calories. He's just a really high activity, high energy guy. Mm-hmm. What a lot of people will do is they go, well, you do cardio in a contest prep. I think both Rosina and then this was one of my other clients, people were shocked at how low her cardio was. I think the highest we ever went, and it was a couple of weeks prior to the show, we did 25 minutes of Stairmaster 4 days a week. And I think we gave her, it was 12,000 steps a day. It is not unheard of for, especially in bikini, girls doing 2 hours of cardio a day. Mm-hmm. But she maintained her rate of loss that we wanted week by week by week. So there was no reason to increase the amount of stressors that she had because she was maintaining the rate of loss that we needed her to have. And all of that additional stress would have done is probably made her experience miserable, but could have potentially interfered with any progress that she was making by just driving the amount of stress that she had up.
So I'm happy that you brought that up because that was something I was going to double click on. I'm sorry if I just interrupted you, Brett. I was going to ask you because you mentioned roughly 1% of total body weight per week lost. Why not 1.5? Why not 2? Why not 3? So, right? And I think you just touched on it, but I think it could be worth circling back to.
Yeah, so it's going to be sort of a twofold answer. So part of this is based on when we look at sustained dieting, what rates of loss preserve muscle. Typically, when we get into far more aggressive diets for long periods of time, you start to see a greater degree of muscle loss. And it's because when you are in such a high stress state, we know that cortisol, which is kind of our stress hormone, is something that's catabolic. It's not tissue selective. So you will start to see potentially muscle loss as people get really, really lean because they're just in a really high stress environment. If you have a slightly slower rate of loss in the neighborhood of 0.5% to about 1% per week, that seems to be in that neighborhood where you can still see a decent rate of loss and there isn't the same degree of accumulating fatigue. Now, this is just a framework that I will use. Usually, I would say it works well for most people, but this would also be a case where, depending on the feedback that I'm getting from a client, we might throttle that down lower. In fact, this is another strategy when you look at contest prep. When you start a contest prep, you are in the freshest state that you're going to be with the greatest capacity to handle stress. Because you have high body fat relative to what you'd be on stage. You haven't been dieting at all, so you're likely coming off either a calorie surplus or a maintenance phase. So you have no buildup of stress from being on low food. That's often an opportunity to be more aggressive with fat loss. Training performance, sleep, all of that is probably still going to be quite good at that point. So usually what I will try to do is in the first half or so of a contest prep, I want to lose about 80% of the weight that we have to. As we get closer and closer and we get into the back half of contest prep and somebody is getting leaner, I'm going to throttle back. And now we're just taking, a half pound here, a half pound there. And now what we are really trying to do is just manage your stress as much as possible to lightly land that plane.
Like you mentioned before, that it's less about weight loss or fat loss and it's more about fatigue management. I remember the first time that you mentioned that in the hypertrophy intensive, even though, we've known each other for a long time, when you provided that, when you, I guess, first introduced that idea, it really changes your, how you make decisions, right? It's not just about necessarily pull back calories, introduce more exercise. It's like, well, no, let's think about potentially the thing that'll make or break this thing, which is how smoked are you by the end of this? And if we can ensure that you're perhaps as fresh as possible while stepping on the stage, in contrast to being ghastly, I'm assuming that would stack the deck in their favor. And it provides context for decision making, which I thought was really great. I always love those things. Even in the context of endurance sport, which I know Brett and I have a little bit more of in common.
Sorry, what is that again?
Although bodybuilding is, I would say, very much an endurance sport. Just
a little
perhaps
different.
Not in the traditional sense, perhaps. But I really love simple cues that kind of lead to a self-organizing of the system. So example, in contrast to telling an athlete to, not overstride or something, you tell them to try to maintain a higher cadence, and it just kind of tends to perhaps control or modify their stride. Or you tell them, instead of worrying about their posture in terms of the details, you tell them just stand tall, right? One thing that just kind of tends to regulate and checks a lot of boxes within the system. I feel similar about the viewing the contest prep as being through the lens of fatigue management, more so than just peeling back food, because fucking anyone can do that. It doesn't actually require that much skill.
I think it's really interesting too, talking about diet as a stressor isn't something I ever really thought about. Aggressive dieting isn't something I've ever done for a sport. But yeah, absolutely. It's a stressor if you're dieting like that in both directions too, I'm sure.
Yep. Yeah. And I think just to, I could keep talking a lot about this, but there was a couple of just additional points I wanted to bring up to wrap this up. Again, I am going to keep harping on setting appropriate timelines is priority number one, or S tier priority, as people call it these days. If you are able to do so, and then I think actually I didn't mention this, but communicating with your client what the targets are. So being hey, the first X number of weeks of prep, this is what we're looking to do. And then this is what we're looking to do. And then this is what you should expect at the end. And then we're all kind of on the same page. So they're not flying blind either. They've got an idea of the behaviors that they are trying to execute are for X purpose.
I love that. Yeah.
And my goal is, so long as they get in the shape that they need to get to on stage. And the irony is usually when you push really, 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 really hard, it's more difficult for them to get into the shape that they need to. If you can manage that stress as much as possible, the wheel just kind of keeps rolling. My goal is to introduce the least amount of suck to them as possible. If they can have multiple high days during the week, if they can have hardly any cardio, if they can have, a couple of times where we take a break off of their diet and they eat at a maintenance or even in a surplus, all of those are going to make that environment way less stressful. And if they are able to do so and still progress at the rate that they're supposed to, it's just going to set them up better for the end. Which leads me to my final 2 points when we're talking about this. One thing that people talk about a lot, and it sort of has this mystique around it, is like peak week. When I think you appropriately manage your prep, your peak week strategy, and but what I mean by peak week, so for people that don't know, when it comes to bodybuilding, you have a certain look that you're trying to attain on stage, and you have strategies. It's typically some form of stress reduction, water manipulation, and carbohydrate manipulation of some sort to achieve a certain look. You should have probably trialed what you want to do at some point in your prep.
Yeah.
Whether that be, there's a variety of peaking strategies. Some people do what's called a linear load or a back load or a front load or whatever it happens to be. They're all different ways of just staggering your carbohydrates throughout the week. You should have at least done it at some point so that you have reliable data for how they're going to respond. So we knew with Rosina, because we had done 2 week-long diet breaks during her prep, that especially when she got really lean by the time we did the second one, by the Thursday morning, so we'd started on a Monday, so she had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of higher food. She looked so good Thursday morning because she had seen some water had kind of dropped off because there was less stress. She had a little bit more glycogen in her muscles just because we'd had more carbohydrates. She had this really, really, really good look. And then Friday, Saturday, Sunday morning, she kind of got softer and softer and softer, and the look wasn't quite as much in line with what we wanted. So I was like, okay, we know that. And then, by the way, I think it was after we'd ended that, by the Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week, when the food was brought back down, she started to look really good again. Mm-hmm. So I was like, we've got this good idea that probably 3 days of loading and about 2 days where we pull food back down, so your midsection has an opportunity to just kind of clear and can go to the washroom and stuff. That gave us your best look. And that is exactly what we did in peak week. Pull her cardio down so that, she didn't have to lose fat anymore, so we could reduce that stressor. We loaded food on, it would have been Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because she had a Sunday show. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, pulled food back down to her low day, Friday, Saturday. Her weight came back down. I think, like I said, she was 116 point something on stage. She ended up winning all 3 of the categories that she was in. And it was not because we did anything magical. It was just, we had already done it before. So we had incredibly reliable data. So there was no guesswork. And then the last thing, again, when we talk about being able to manage that fatigue really well, the other thing is when you absolutely hammer people and they dig really deep, they often also experience a really big rebound back the other direction post-show. Because often psychologically, they're not in a great place. Their hunger hormones are absolutely insane. Their body is quite sensitive to food and fluid fluctuations. So these are situations where you see people where they overeat and they can't stop themselves. So that they have these body image issues because they've just rebound back up. Their body is holding on to all of this water because they're eating, carbohydrates and sodium far past what they've been doing for months and months on end. So you end up in this really messy situation psychologically and physically. Whereas if you're in a position where what we did with Rosina, because she'd already had a few high days of food, we had a very gentle kind of approach the last couple of weeks where she was like, yeah, I'm excited to have food with my friends. And we had kind of planned a couple of social meals, and she was, I think within 2 days, she was like, well, I'll just eat my meal plan again.
Nice.
And it was just because she wasn't put into this state of just complete, being completely, what's the word I'm looking for here? Deprived of any kind of nutrients for weeks and months on end. So
I kind of see some parallels. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, if there's one takeaway from this, is managing your timeline and managing stress is the biggest pillars when it comes to, in my opinion, bringing an athlete to stage.
That's
Love
cool.
that.
It reminds me a little bit, and I see some parallels with what we were talking about a bit in the hypertrophy course.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, your client is going to come in with intensity. Like, they know they're about to lift something really, really heavy, and it's going to be really hard, and they're going to be very fatigued at the end of it. You don't have to give them any more, and you don't have to
Yeah.
like push them harder and go, come on, like, screaming at them during their set. Instead, you should take them and try to focus that energy in and try to get exactly what you're getting out of
Yeah.
it, but not add to it. Just kind of take that and focus it, which is kind of like similar. Like, you're not adding more stress and not hammering them harder. You're just taking that energy and focusing it to the proper ways to get the goal that you want.
Totally agree.
We're gonna have to wrap this up in a moment, and I think the one of the things that really stands out to me today from your two case studies is, and it's such a cliche, and we talk about it even in the level one, not of the hypertrophy intensive, but just the exercise mechanics level one course. Just this idea of like putting like the personal back in personal training, so to speak, and that it is and should be in many ways a client derived process. Of course, you could just like take a program and throw it at a bunch of people. It's going to work for some. Some people are going to respond really well, some people less. But what you guys just highlighted today was two entirely different approaches to two completely different people who have different circumstances, are at different places in their life. We talk about Brett's client, who's a doctor, right? I think if I remember correctly, Ryan, in the case of Rosina, we're talking about 24-year-old who is like a new competitor, is exploring like the realm of entrepreneurship as a side hustle, like just like, and also living in Vancouver, like just like completely different people. And it's like, it makes sense that the program would be completely different for them. And it's also, I think, just like worth double clicking on. This is one of the things that I was really hoping for when we kind of tabled this idea of doing a case study episode, is to like notice, like, when you start kind of peeling back some of the layers, holy fuck, like the approach is entirely different. The philosophy is different. Like, we're talking about, having investment weeks with your doctor, right? So it's like flexibility is the name of the game for the sake of adherence. And then Rye, for you, we're talking about prefacing the journey, them explaining what phase of their journey that they're in. We're aiming for a certain rate of loss for this week. We want to hit 80% of your fat loss within the first 50% of the phase. Like, it's so much more calculated. And I know that you don't take that approach with everyone. Like, when we worked together at Good Life Queensview, like I know that you didn't just work with competitors back then, right? Because it was less your thing back then as well. But you had the everyday person, and how the strategies that you would use for all those people are different. And I think it's an important thing to double click on, because I think that, how would I say, it can be sometimes easy for people to fall into ruts. I have, for sure, where you kind of start just kind of giving the same stuff to people. And perhaps that is not always necessarily a bad thing, especially if the avatar themselves are, like perhaps like more similar than not. There's no issue with programs being similar to each other. But I think that's, for me, one of the things that's been really cool with today is just like, fuck, these are two completely different avatars, two completely different people, different goals, different challenges, and to hear your solutions about how you kind of went about that, for me, I thought was really cool. And so I really appreciate you guys sharing that.
Goes back to a couple other things we talk about a lot. One is, we got to say it every episode, right? Nuance. Like, there is a lot of nuance between the people. But then the other thing that I noticed is, like, concepts over systems, is that like,
Yes.
it's not necessarily like a different system that we're applying it. We're both, taking from the same concepts and like the
100%.
general knowledge that we
Well
have
said.
about people and applying them in very, very different ways. In that, like, obviously I wouldn't be as great of a coach of bodybuilders as Ryan, but like with my tool bag, I could probably go in and do a reasonably good job, just like he could with my doctor client. Because
No
we're
doubt.
pulling from a similar bag of tricks, even though the programs are totally different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I think you guys both summed it up quite nicely. I think there, as we talk about it a lot, kind of basing decisions on, first principles or base components, whatever phrasing you want to use. And then you deal with the problem in front of you. I think a lot of the time, if you're a coach or a trainer, you are a hired problem solver, and your clients get to offload the problem solving responsibility to you. And then I think just the wider your knowledge base is, you just have a greater capacity to solve a variety of different problems within a variety of different contexts.
Hell yeah, man. It comes back to, last thing I'll say, I think before we wrap, is one of the things that we talk about in the exercise mechanic is that in many ways, depth equals breadth, like a depth of competence and having a lot of tools. I'm not sure what the difference is between a tool bag and a toolbox, Brett.
Yeah. I was going to let that slide.
But you think of like the greater the breadth of tools that you have gives you an opportunity to then leverage all those tools at various stages in their journey, depending on the challenges that they're facing externally and internally, perhaps their needs, their physiological needs. You can use all of those things at different times as a means of taking them deeper. And I think that's something that's kind of interesting in the fitness industry, is that depth of competence within one individual thing is useful. And also, because we deal with humans, holistic humans that are complex and layered and messy and emotional and all that crap, having a breadth of tools helps you go deep. So fortunately for those that like learning, the fitness industry is ripe with opportunities to learn. And for those that
Shameless
like
plug for the exercise mechanic.
yeah, Hundo P, yeah, take our stuff. And then but for people that don't like nuance, people that don't like complexity, people that want things that are just like a little bit more simple and linear, it's not just tends to not be the industry for them. But if you like that process of dealing with people and solving problems and not always having the answer, but you find the process of finding the answer interesting and fulfilling, then the fitness industry is a great place to be. In closing, gentlemen, thank you for today. That was really fun. I really appreciate you guys doing that. That's been really great, and I look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.
Have a nice day. Later.
See ya.